Most of you know that our system of checks and balances is based on three branches of government. The first we talked about was the legislative branch, Congress. That's covered in Article 1 of the Constitution. Second was the executive branch, the President. That's covered in Article 2 of the Constitution. But Madison also had a third branch, the judicial branch, which is Article 3. Now, in England, back before they even started settling America, and then the colonies in America, and now with our 13 states, we've all got judges. I mean, everybody had always had judges. There had been courts that had been around forever. But it wasn't until little Jimmy Madison came along that anybody thought of the courts as a branch of government. That's unique. That's original. The court, as people had always understood it, is there to interpret the law. Judges are knowledgeable in the law. And there's sort of an assumption there that the law is just there. Nobody really gave any thought to where did it come from? How did we get the law? There's an assumption there that the law just exists. It's like it's created by God and it's there in the heavens, and judges know the law. And their job is to interpret the law and apply it in specific circumstances, in specific situations when there's conflicts about the law and when people don't understand the law and there's a dispute over it, because it's so easy for the law to be very confusing and very complicated. It's very easy for one party to come in and say with his or her lawyers, this is what the law is, and the other side says, no, this is what the law is. And so you have to have a judge who is knowledgeable, who is an expert on this, coming along and saying, no, here is what the law is, and here's what happens then. This is why we're going to go with party A, and they're going to get what they want, and party B is not. A lot of times it's over property, who owns the property. And it's up to the judge to decide who does. In this case, in this particular situation, here's what the law means. That's what judges do. Well, a lot of times then judges have to interpret the law, and it's a conflict, and they have to decide which law, because the party of one side can say, look, here's this act of Parliament that makes a law. And somebody else comes along and says, yeah, but here is this court that in the past had said this law, so that's what the law is. And a lot of times you have to make a decision about which law you're going to follow. Somebody says this is a law and somebody says this. Which one do you follow? And you have to sort of figure out which has priority, because sometimes there are conflicts. Sometimes one law totally contradicts another. So you have to decide which one has priority. Which law is, if you will, supreme. Which law comes over the other. Now what Jimmy Madison was saying was, we're going to have a situation where there's going to be a supreme law that always overrules the others. If there's a conflict, one law always has priority. It is always supreme. And, as I hope you can guess, the supreme law of the land is the Constitution. That always has priority over everything else. The Constitution is the highest law in the land. It has preference over any other law that might conflict to it. And the Supreme Court, then, we're going to have a court as part of the judicial system. Their job is to do what courts have always done, decide how to interpret the law in a particular case. How do you interpret it? Which law has supremacy? And that's what judges have always had to do. And people didn't quite figure out the implications of what Madison was having the Supreme Court do. By putting the Supreme Court in a position to decide which law is higher, and that the Constitution is always the highest law. What he was saying, and people didn't quite get onto this because it was so novel. This is, as I say, very unusual. Everybody understood about the idea of, sort of checks and balances between the House and the Senate, because they'd always had that between the House of Commons and the House of Lords. They knew how to deal with that. And all the state constitutions all had two houses of their legislature, so people are familiar with that. But this idea of the court having the Constitution as the supreme law, what that means is that if Congress passes a law that contradicts the Constitution, then the court can decide, and they always have to decide which law comes first, but by doing that, what they'll be saying is that the Constitution has priority over this law, and therefore the Supreme Court can say an act of Congress is unconstitutional if it violates the Constitution, because the Constitution always comes first. So the Supreme Court could declare an act of Congress unconstitutional. So the Supreme Court could become part of our system of checks and balances. And that's what Madison wanted. He wants sort of a superior check that could overrule even the president. That the House could pass something, the Senate could pass something, the president could sign it. It's a law. It's an act of Congress. It's on the books. It's been signed by the president. It's in effect. But if it violates the Constitution, then the Supreme Court could say it's unconstitutional. And we're having that as a check and balance so that even Congress and the president cannot take away people's rights. The Constitution guarantees that we will protect our rights, we will protect our freedom, we'll protect our liberty, and that's why I like the textbook of the book, the title of the textbook. It's always talking about how Americans seek to protect freedom, and the way they're doing it, they protect liberty, the word that Professor Foner used in his title. They're going to protect liberty. We're going to protect liberty. In this case, the source we got to worry about is the mob. A majority. The mob may gain a majority of the House and pass some law, and the Senate may go along with it, and the President may go along with it. But if it's a violation of natural rights, if it's a violation of liberty, then the Supreme Court can act as a protector, as a final sort of check and balance on the power of even the Congress, both houses of Congress, and the President. So we count on the Supreme Court. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't, because it's still based on people. But that's the idea. The idea is we're going to have, by three branches, we're going to have better protection, and we'll protect against the basic problem, mob rule. And the issue is, if a mob is a minority, it's not a problem. If it's a small group of people, they may be out there crying, we've got to take away people's rights, whatever, But we just have majority rule. And that's simple. That's the basic concept of a republic. That's majority rule. And that's easy. The danger is, what happens if the mob is a majority? In a way, it's nice to have a republic to counteract the possibility that you're going to have a monarch who's got absolute power. The power of the tyranny of a monarchy. And you check that with majority rule. But then now you've got the other problem. The other side of the problem is, what happens if the majority is the tyrant? If they want to take away rights of a minority? So you got to have some sort of check on the tyranny of the majority. And that's what we hope we'll have set up by having this very complicated system of checks and balances. We're hoping we can somehow check a person who wants to be a tyrant and be an absolute ruler, and we'll have the whole complicated system of checks and balances ending with the Supreme Court saying that what this tyrant wants to do violates the Constitution as the highest law in the land. So that's done. There were a lot of other issues that the Constitution Convention had to deal with. They made all kinds of other compromises. Some people would say it's a maze of compromises. It's a package of compromises, which is true. I mean, they had all sorts of minor issues. They had debates about this, they had debates about that, and they compromised over this, they compromised over that. You know, I get a kick sometimes. People talk about, well, the Founding Fathers wanted this. Well, that's just stupid. You know, anybody who says that, you should be able to take that as a hint that they don't know what they're talking about. Because the Founding Fathers didn't have one thing that they agreed on. I mean, they disagreed about everything. So there's no such thing as, well, the Founding Fathers wanted this. You know, some people wanted this, and some people wanted that. People disagreed over this, people disagreed over that. There's people who took one side of this issue, and somebody else took the other side. And in fact, even when they finished, not everybody was happy. So who were the Founding Fathers? The ones who signed the Constitution? Or the ones who didn't? There were 55 people who were delegates to the Constitution at one time or another, to the convention. 55. 39 signed it. 16 did not. So when you talk about the Founding Fathers, who are you talking about? The 39 who signed it, or the 16 who didn't? The 16 who didn't want to sign it, who didn't even approve of it. They didn't even like the Constitution. So it's a situation where we just have all sorts of issues, and we got down and we worked out a whole bunch of compromises, and we came up with the Constitution. Now we had to get it ratified. And so throughout the country, the convention wrapped up in, I think it was about September of 1787. In the fall of 1787, states began setting up special elections to elect the special conventions that are going to be having to ratify the Constitution. Each state is going to have a constitutional convention for ratification purposes. They're doing that. They're having the elections. They're setting it up, and the conventions are starting to meet. In some states, the Constitution was absolutely accepted. Some states ratified it quickly. I think the first state was Delaware, which ratified the Constitution in the late fall of 1787. It was like December or so, and the vote was unanimous. In Delaware, there was overwhelming support for the Constitution. The vote was unanimous. I think the second one was Pennsylvania. So we've got one of our smallest states, and then one of our largest states. Pennsylvania was the second largest state, second to Virginia. So one of our smallest states was one of the first ones to ratify, and then one of the largest states, Pennsylvania, ratified it too. It wasn't unanimous in Pennsylvania, but it was a very strong vote. Pennsylvania had a very large convention. They had over like 300 delegates at their convention, and the vote was something like 250 to 20. I don't know what the numbers are, but it was a very, very favorable vote in Pennsylvania for the Constitution. And then other states started ratifying in the early months of 1788. And in some states, a couple other states, it was unanimous. There was so much support for it. But then things kind of slowed down. And in some of the states, there was opposition to the Constitution. Not everybody in this country favored the Constitution. And in some states, there was substantial opposition to it. So we use the terms now, the Federalists. The Federalists are now using that term, and they are actively supporting the Constitution. But there were people who opposed them, and we call them simply the Anti-Federalists. And in some states, the Anti-Federalists were quite strong. There was severe opposition to ratification. The Anti-Federalists are a very large number of people. They have a wide range of reasons why they oppose the Constitution. It's complicated. Not every state is the same. In some states, certain issues come up, and in others, they're different. Everybody who was opposed to the Constitution maybe had their own reasons. Some people opposed it because it gave too much power to the states. Some people opposed it because it didn't give enough power to the states. Some people wanted to have purely the New Jersey plan. Some people wanted to have purely the Virginia plan. And people out there in the country, the delegates to the conventions, all had different ideas, and they all had, but many of them came up with reasons not to ratify the Constitution. And it's complicated, and there are a lot of issues. But let me just simplify it and give you what I think are the two issues that came up most often as why we should not ratify the Constitution. One was the office of president. That office made many, many Americans nervous. Now, I haven't talked much about the state constitutions. Every state has a constitution. Every state has a governor. I mean, that's the way it works. You have a governor, that's the executive branch. They didn't use the term executive branch, but they have a governor. But generally they gave the governors very little power. And this is the way things had been when they'd been colonies, when they'd had the assemblies. Remember I told you that under the way that every colony operated, the governor is very much under the control of the assembly. Americans, even before they became independent, had felt that the assembly, elected by the people, should be the strongest one. And the assemblies could, basically put the royal governors in colonial days under their thumbs. And most constitutions of the states sort of followed that. The legislatures usually had the greatest power. The governors had very little power, and they were very much at the mercy of the legislature. And that keeps with America's feelings that this is not we don't want monarchy here. Well, now we're going to have a president. Is that like a monarchy? We don't want that. So there were many people who objected to the Constitution because the very fact that the president had as much power that he could veto an act of Congress, and it would take a 2/3 vote to override his veto, that made people think, oh, the president is going to want to become a monarch. We don't want that in America. So that was one issue. The other issue is that the Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights. And many people said, wait a minute. The whole purpose of this Constitution is to protect rights. How come there's no Bill of Rights? You should have a Bill of Rights. England had had a Bill of Rights that went back to 1689. Every state had a Bill of Rights. They're all different, and some of them were parts of their constitution, some of them were state laws. They're all different. But there's an idea of a Bill of Rights that you should spell out what rights are. And every state had a Bill of Rights. So then many Americans said, why isn't there a Bill of Rights in the Constitution? So they don't want it. That's why they're anti-federalists. They don't want to approve a Constitution unless it has a Bill of Rights. So we got several states to ratify, and it was one after another, and eventually we got to the point where, like, by the summer of 1788, now 7 states have ratified, but in the other states, there's opposition. The anti-federalists are in a majority. Some of those states were small and didn't matter. I mean, Rhode Island, of course, they're not even having a convention. They didn't send a delegation to the convention. They haven't had anything to do with it, and they still won't do it, so they're not going to ratify. Okay, well, but Rhode Island, nobody counts. But among the states that had not yet ratified were Virginia, which was our largest state, and New York, which was, one of the other states. It's like the 4th largest, but it contains one of our major cities, New York City. And it would be really hard. We could get along without Rhode Island, but it would really be hard to get along without Virginia and New York. So those 2 states became sort of the center of the debate over ratification. We've got 7 states ratified. We only need 2 more. We're not going to get Rhode Island. We're not going to get North Carolina. I don't know what the others are. But we've got to get New York and Virginia. So that's what we'll have to talk about next.